Science and technology in the 1920s grew a lot. Some examples of this were the Scopes monkey trials, the airline and pilot industry, and the radio. The Scope monkey trials was when a professor in 1925 decided to teach his students evolution, and people did not agree with his teachings because they feared that it would upset the religious teachings in the school, because that was religion and schools were still combined in 1920. And the airline and pilot industry was growing because after World War One, the planes were beginning to be used as passenger planes and passenger and cargo planes. And then the radio was one of the biggest advancements because it connected the United States for sports, music, news, and other things like that. And a traditional example of this is in the 1920s, religion in schools were thought to be that they should be together and science should have been kept out. And a modern example is that the sports industry has grown from the radio to the TV, and TV had the same effect as the radio had in the 1920s. And a modern example of this is, as in the traditional example, when they say religion and school should be kept together, in today's society we believe that religion and schools should be kept separate and should not be taught together. Society in the 1920s was made up of many factors. Some of these were the KKK, Prohibition, the modern woman, and Al Capone. The KKK was a organization that reemerged in the 1920s, and they became nationally renowned, and they had their own crusade to bring justice for the American people. Prohibition, which was the banning of all alcoholic beverages in the United States, led to speakeasies, which led to the rise of powerful gangsters such as Al Capone, who is one of the most notorious gangsters in the United States and made most of his money off of running speakeasies. The modern woman was a woman who went against all the normal standards that a woman would have to abide by in previous times. And the traditional example of this society was Prohibition, and this example the Prohibition caused the rise of Al Capone, and the modern example is the modern woman in the 1920s, very similar to the modern woman in the late 1900s into early 2000s.
Art and literature in the 1920s. So this sums up pretty much like how literature in the 1920s, art in the 20s, and the Harlem Renaissance. I'll start over here, the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance was the big industry of African American culture. It just broke through and was very popular at that time. And there's artists like Louis Armstrong, Langston Hughes, people that are being well known because of the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance was huge for the African American community because it established them more as a race, and it was more it really influenced the American culture that we have today and everything that we have, our culture, music, our lifestyle, stuff like that. So it's Harlem Renaissance. That's a picture of a man playing a piano. And with the literature in the 1920s, as people became more literate, they could read more, they could write, so they wanted to purchase more novels of authors, and authors became winning Nobel Peace Prizes for their work. And a really important figure of literature in the 20s was F. Scott Fitzgerald. He would name the 20s the Jazz Age because in his story, The Great Gatsby, it was about how this man, Jay Gatsby, he was super popular at that time, he was super rich, and he was spending it on everything that he wanted, and that's pretty much the freedom and opportunities that they had in the 20s. And that's the picture of the Great Gatsby. And for the modern Art Deco was the main style of design, architecture in the 1920s. Art Deco was originally introduced in Europe, later on expanded in the States, and it expressed just the style of art that he used and stuff like that. And So business and economy of the 1920s. And so it's Henry Ford, there's the farmers' problems, there's consumerism, and then there's credit. I'm going to start with Henry Ford. So in 1903, Henry Ford established a Ford Motor Company. With Ford's new scientific ideas, he released an assembly line. And the assembly line, it produced more cars more efficiently and more costs. It was more cheaper for people to buy them. And the first example of this was a Model T. A Model T was Henry Ford's probably most important idea they ever made, because it was middle class people could afford it, and it was just a huge increase in the sales. So that's some Model T right there. And for problems with farmers, so after World War I, the farmers were they couldn't pay off all their loans, and they were just in huge crisis because the need for food and everything like that. And so the prices on the farm went up, and the need for expensive machinery for farmers, they had to get that to produce their crops and livestock. And as the prices fell down, the farmers couldn't pay off all the money that they purchased, and this later on they began to lose their farms, and that's the imagery there of the farmers losing their crops and with their livestock. And with consumerism, that's the radio. So the Roaring Twenties is what it's called, and many Americans had extra money to spend, so they spent it on their own individual needs. So they were buying the most expensive cars for Henry Ford, and that's that radio. And buying on credit. So during 1920s, people were purchasing on credit, which means you could purchase now and pay later. And this was the new philosophy in the 20s.
Entertainment and sports of the 1920s. The four terms were jazz, Babe Ruth, and baseball, boxing, and movies in Hollywood. And in connection to today, music in the 1920s was very popular in new form of music, almost as rap is today, because most teenagers that in our class and everyone all listens to rap music and find it as the best kind of music that we have right now. And in the entertainment and sports category, most of the terms and terminology are all modernistic ideas, because in this time sports were just becoming popular because of the radio, and so these new sports were beginning to be listened to, and it was a new way of thinking of the modernism idea, and not really any traditionalism ideas. In 1920s for nation, the four terms were the Red Scare, immigration restrictions, Sacco-Vanzetti case, black migration. For traditionalism, a great example is the Sacco-Vanzetti case, where the two Italian immigrants were sentenced to death on murder when their main basis of being set on death was that they were just immigrants. And this was the traditionalist way of thinking, while the modernist way of thinking was black migration, and because the black people were expressing themselves in new ways like they do today with the school walkouts and the gun restriction. And I'm not just singling out African Americans, it's everyone, and it was kind of the same way as what they were doing today.